My guest on the podcast today is yet another legend in the sport of triathlon, the one and only Bob Babbitt. Bob has been around triathlon pretty much as long as triathlon has been around Bob. And while both have aged incredibly well, neither really looks any worse for wear. It's impossible for me to give Bob the proper introduction that he so well deserves, but I will try to hit some of the highlights. He was there back in 1980 for the third ever Ironman event in Hawaii, and he went on to complete several more before Ironman was anything like what it is today. He's the co-founder of competitive group that now owns and runs, among many other publications, Triathlete Magazine, for which I am a medical contributor. He founded the Challenged Athletes Foundation that supports many athletes around the world in their efforts to compete in our sport. He's an inductee to both the Ironman and USAT Halls of Fame, and the man behind the very popular Breakfast with Bob series of interviews that comes from Kona every year. But I am really excited to say that he's here with me today to talk about all things triathlon from his many decades in the sport. Welcome, Bob, and thank you so much for joining me on the TriDoc Podcast.
Jeff, it's an honor. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, many decades. That's a little overwhelming when I hear that.
I know, right? I myself have been in the sport for now going on over 20 years. And when I look back and see, gosh, where I've been and what I've accomplished, it's amazing how fast the time goes by. And from your perspective, I've had the great pleasure of talking to Dan Emfield, who also was around at the beginning of the sport, and hearing that perspective of how things have changed is always really fantastic. And I'm so glad that our sport really is within this generation, and so we still can talk to the people who were there right at the beginning, and it's really a fantastic thing that we can take advantage of. So thank you again for being here. I want to begin really with that. And what can you tell us about the beginnings of the sport? I mean, you were there really at the, I love looking at those pictures of you back in San Diego, taking on the San Diego Challenge races. So tell us, what are some of your fond memories from the early days of the sport?
Well, sports started here in San Diego in 1974 with the San Diego Track Club. And really, triathlon was not really a sport. It was a workout. And all these guys were serious runners, and they started doing these events at Fiesta Island where they would do on a Tuesday, they do a swim, bike, run, or swim, run, bike, and they just sort of mix it up, and it wasn't considered its own sport. And then in 74, they put on the first ever Mission Bay Triathlon, and that's really sort of kicked things off. I didn't move out San Diego until 78, so that's when I first was exposed to it. And my roommate was a guy named Ned Overend, who went on to become world mountain bike champion. But back then, mountain bikes hadn't been invented yet. So he was a mechanic at San Diego Suzuki, and I was a school teacher. And we started going to local races. And then we read this article in Sports Illustrated in 1979 after a local bar owner named Tom Warren won the Ironman in 1979. And we read this 8-page article in Sports Illustrated. And you think about it, those 15 people in the race, 12 finishers, and they did 8 pages in the Bible of sport, Sports Illustrated. That thing showed up every Thursday, and you read it cover to cover. We read this article, and we're like, oh my God, this 2.4 mile swim, 112 mile bike ride, 26.2 mile run. And we, couldn't go online to figure out how to sign up for it or to find out information. So we did the next best thing. We tracked down Tom Warren, the guy who won the race and lived in San Diego. And he used to put on an event called the Tug Swim Run Swim, one of the original endurance events. You swam a half mile in the ocean, and you ran 5 miles on the beach, and then you swam half mile in the ocean again. And the key was, if you were a runner, is you wanted to run really hard during that second part of the run, because otherwise the swimmers just swam right over your ass and just love dunking you, because it was called swimmer's revenge, because most races finished in the run. And this was a rare opportunity for the swimmers to actually close it by pushing you down deep in the ocean and coming in. In fact, when wetsuits first came into vogue and people could wear wetsuits in races, Tommy Warren was a purist. And people were like, well, I want to wear a wetsuit. He says, no problem. You can wear a wetsuit. When I shoot the gun, you can run over and put on your wetsuit. And once you put it on, you can't take it off.
It's got to be on for the run.
Yeah. So Tommy was one of those sort of eccentric guys. And when we first went to meet with him and we called him up and said, hey, Tommy, can you tell us about this Ironman thing? He says, oh, sure, no problem. Come to my office. And I'm like, well, where's your office? Well, west side of the street, just south of Crystal Pier in Pacific Beach. I'm like, oh, no problem. So we come over. There's no offices there. It's a parking lot. And then we see this motorhome with bikes in the back and running shoes tied around the side view mirrors and a paddleboard on top. And I sort of put my head inside and he goes, Babbitt, welcome to my office. And because he owned a bar, there was a payphone behind him. So he would go and swim out in the ocean or paddleboard and run 5 miles every morning. Actually, he would run to a place called the Jetty. It was like 2.5 miles each way. And it was a white lamppost at the turnaround where he ran. There's actually to this day a black line around that pole from his hand every time he would do this run. Probably did this run thousands of times over the years. And it was there's a black line from his hand making, leaving greasy handprint around this pole. And, so the other part about his swim, the swim, run, swim, it didn't finish at the finish. You came across the finish line and that was great. But the key was to run another 4 blocks to his tavern because the first 75 people got breakfast and a Tug's glass, right? So you came across the finish line, you got your popsicle stick with your number on it and just kept going. And the key was you wanted to be standing there with your plate of runny eggs and your Tug's glass in the top 75 when the 76th guy showed up and got nothing, right? That was real bragging rights. So then, Tommy took us to this bar. This is 9:30 in the morning. Took us to a bar right behind his office, his motorhome, by a place called TD Hayes. And remember, he's our only link to figure out how to do this thing. And as he's explaining, getting a bike and training, he's drinking beer and he's got a magic marker and he keeps making marks on his arm. And we're like, oh, Mr. Warren, sir, well, why are you using the magic marker? He's like, well, I have a little bit of a drinking problem. So I make a mark every time I have a beer. When I get to my sleeve, I go home. Then he had his bike mounted in the sauna and he'd ride 5 hours a day in the sauna to get ready for this race in the heat and why. Nowadays, that's a Lionel Sanders workout. But back then, he was certifiably crazy. So he, told us, go get a bike. So we got bikes at a police auction. And the first bike I got cost $75. The whole back end was burnt. I had fuzzy raccoon seat cover. It had reflectors on it, had a kickstand. Because I thought we went for a ride one day and averaged like 10 miles an hour. So we're thinking 112 miles, we're going to be out there in the dark. So I'm going to go out and get pannier, sleeping bag, and tent. Because my guess is you swim 2.4, ride 56, camp out, and ride back the next day and do the marathon. So that's what we, sort of had pannier, sleeping bag, and tent on the bike. Thought it was a 2-day thing. He really had no clue. And, then we owned rock climbing helmets because actually we did a rock climbing camp for kids. Ned and I did that. And rock climbing helmets have no holes. So when you go ride, it felt like your head was going to explode. There was like no ventilation whatsoever, which is one of the reasons we thought there's no way you could ride 112 miles in one day. This is going to be a 2-day thing. So it was a little bit of a learning thing. The funny part was when I rolled off on Oahu, there was no bike boxes. You just rolled your bike on the plane and they shoved it in the cargo. So when my bike comes rolling off with the flat proof tires and the pannier, sleeping bag, and tent and foam grips and the fuzzy raccoon seat cover comes rolling off, and I've got this big beard that you've seen, and Gordon Haller, who won in '78, had a big beard. So all these Navy SEALs who were racing in 1980 are looking at me, thinking I'm Gordon Haller, looking at this bike and thinking this bike won the Ironman. And they're looking at it like you'd be looking at Lance Armstrong's bike. Oh, why is he doing? Oh, there must be something aerodynamic. And then I also had a Radio Shack radio mounted on the handlebars so that I had tunes to listen to along the way. And it was,
and did you do the race that way, or did you quickly realize that no, it's one day I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff?
No, I had beige hiking shorts and only guy to do the Ironman with a leather belt, and a belt and a long sleeve cotton jersey shirt. And I was number 3 in the race. And I was number 3 because I set my $25 in third, not like I was seeded or anything from finishing third the year before. And during the race itself, well, the day before the race, the race director calls us into this meeting. And now, because of the piece in Sports Illustrated, things gone from 15 starters to 108 starters. The event's booming. And he goes, listen, guys, and Ned and I are standing on the deck of the hotel, and the waves are breaking against the building. We're talking 10-foot surf. That day, Dave Scott had been caught out in the surf for, like he was going for a little swim, and they were, swept out to sea. And that guy's top swimmer.
Yeah.
So anyways, we're looking at the surf going, if we're swimming Waikiki rough water swim tomorrow, we will die. There is no way, because we did all of our swimming in 120 length to the mile pool. So we had no idea. We'd been in surf, but nothing like this. And they call us on the meeting, and the race director goes, guys, I'm in a predicament. I've got ABC Wild World of Sports. They just called me up, and they're in town to shoot cliff diving on Sunday. And our event is on Saturday, and they want to shoot our event. But if we have to postpone it today, which at this point we will, I'll lose ABC. So I'm moving the swim to Ala Moana Channel, which is calm. And Ned and I obviously are pretty excited, but Dave Scott and all the Navy SEALs are like, what a pussy event. You can't move the swim. It's called the Ironman for a reason. And we're like, thank God we're going to live. And the next day we get out there, and, I'm swimming, and it was 4 lengths, and there was a guy in the race named John Huckabee, the Incredible Huck. His claim to fame, he'd run the Athens Marathon 3 times in one day, right? He'd gone, back out. The only problem is, and he's 59 years old. Back then, that was like ancient. And he's the only guy with sponsorship. He had like Acme Meats or something on the back of his jacket, the Incredible Huck. Well, he didn't know how to swim at all. Had never swam in his life. So as I'm swimming and staying as close to shore as possible, I swim down. It was 4 lengths. On my way back, my second length, I nearly run in the Huck, who's walking in the knee-deep water, moving his arm like this. He's the only guy in history to get blisters on his feet during the swim portion of the Ironman Triathlon World Championship. He walked all 2.4 miles, and then they lost him. There's no cutoff times. They lost him in the middle of the night. They had no idea where he was at 2 a.m, and they found him coming out of a diner in Waikiki at 2 a.m. Just because it was, you would support crew. There was no aid stations, no roads were blocked off. We had to get off our bike. As a medical guy, they had a rule that if you lost 5% of your body weight during the race, they pulled you out of the race. So they had scales. You had to get off your bike, I think 3 times during the bike, and then in the run, then they would weigh you to make sure you didn't lose too much weight. Where the science came from, I have no idea. So anyways, I get off the bike a few times. I'm wearing Jack Purcell's. Nobody knew about bike shoes. Dave Scott actually had bike shoes, and one of the cleats was messed up. So like in the movie Breaking Away, they duct taped his foot to the pedal for 112 miles, right? So that they didn't get through the thing.
Yeah.
So I'm riding along, and my crew at mile 25, and I was a school teacher, and one of the kids I taught, her dad lived over on the island. So he showed up in his Fiat convertible with his 2 girlfriends that morning. I gave him like 25 loaves of Hawaiian sweetbread and Gatorade, because again, science-wise, we had no idea nutrition, none of that stuff. We just thought, oh, carbs, we better have some carbs, we better have some sugar. So 25 miles in, my crew was standing on the side of the road, and I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I'm tuning in my radio, and I'm going to get a handoff like in the Tour de France. And they hand me a brown bag with a Big Mac, fries, and a Coke. And then at mile 90, I got a root beer snow cone, and then come in at the end of the bike, and there's my crew. And I come in at Aloha Tower, and I see a bamboo mat set up. And I come in, and they've got a boom box. And they're like, how about a massage? I'm like, you know what? I am so stiff. So I got a 45-minute massage between the bike and the run, which felt really, really good. And then headed out on the run. As I'm heading out on the run, there's, they weigh us. And then I'm running through and waddling through Waikiki, eating Hawaiian sweetbread and drinking Gatorade. And about mile 5, they weigh us again. And the guy, I could hear him on the walkie-talkie. He's like, can you give me that again? He's gained 5 pounds. He can't gain weight doing this thing. And I could. And then we're running along, and we get to the last part of the race. You come up, you come up Diamond Head, and then you drop into Kapiolani Park to finish the race. And my crew is behind me in their Fiat with their headlights on me as I'm going up Diamond Head. And I'm just thinking to myself, I thought I was going to take 2 days to do this thing. And I'm going to finish this in 1 day. And there's gotta be a band at the finish. There's gotta be all sorts of excitement, cheerleaders. And as I drop into Kapiolani Park, all I see a white chalk line and a light bulb over my head. And I sort of slow down, and I hear this voice out in the darkness like, hey, you. Yeah. You in the race? Yeah. You're done. No Mike Riley, no band, no cheerleaders, one guy doing 1-hour push-ups in the park. And that was it. And me. But I knew when I left that finish line that this had been something special. It changed me. I knew right then that if I could feel so just ecstatic about finishing this thing, that this thing was going to catch on. And it became my mission to spread the word about this silly event and this silly sport. And I came back, and I continued teaching school, but I also became the LA editor for a magazine called Running News, and convinced Mike Plant, who was the editor, to change it to Running and Triathlon News based on the idiots who were in the sport, who were the 108 of us who did this event. This sport's going to be huge. It was 108 of us doing the race. But there was just something you could feel that this thing was, and think about it. The first triathlon ever was in 1974. By 1996, we'd been accepted in the Olympics. And by 2000, we were in Olympic Games. And that's unbelievable.
Yeah. And it's, I totally get it, because the thing that motivated you, that finish line, is the same thing that motivates people now, 42 years later. I mean, it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah. It doesn't, when people ask about how the sport is different, obviously it's different with technology, et cetera. But when you stand at that finish line and you see the raw motion of people coming across that line and what it means to them and how it changes them, that has not changed. That's still there. And it doesn't matter if you're like you've been doing this forever. You have that same feeling when you come across the finish line, if it's your first Ironman or if it's your 50th.
Right. And I'm curious, I've heard you speak about how the sport went from its humble beginnings through the article that you've referenced now, the Sports Illustrated article, and of course, ABC's coverage with Julie Moss.
Yep.
And you were in it at the time. Did you have looking back, everybody obviously appreciates how Julie Moss impacted the sport, but at the time, was there a moment when you really sort of said, oh, it's the inflection point is right now, like it is really about to take off?
Things really happened quickly, because I remember running out in Penasquitos Canyon, because I was in that race. And until later, when I talked to Valerie Silk about everything that happened, and Valerie Silk was the race director, you kept thinking, how did Kathleen pass her and not see her? I don't get how that happens. Well, you saw it on TV. Who the hell looks on the ground for the person they're trying to catch? So I get it. But back then we were like, we all had heard the hubbub, but there was no video until the show came out. Nobody really knew what the hell happened. And what people don't realize is, Valerie Silk she was married to this guy, Hank, who was a race director. And so they were sort of she was working with Hank a little bit, but she thought it was the stupidest thing in the world that their health club, Nautilus Health Clubs, that they were even involved with this silly event. She's like, 15 people. What a waste of our time, right? So, but what she loved to do was organize. And when she and Hank split and she took over the event, she moved the event to the Big Island. And she's an organizer, and she's this mother hen. All throughout the 80s, you would get birthday cards from Valerie thanking you for supporting the Ironman, right? That's what built the sport. But in that year, in 82, there was a group called Freewheeling Films that came over to shoot the Ironman. And when they called Valerie about, hey, we'd like to shoot the Ironman, she was like, well, I have an agreement with ABC that they're exclusive to cover the Ironman. And they were like, oh, well, they won't mind. We're good friends. She said, oh, well, okay. Well, they did mind. And throughout the day, you have this Freewheeling Films group with Bruce Dern, with one of the classic sound bites of all time, talking about the Ironman and how that's last hour in the lava fields, at 110 degrees, we'll find out who the hell our Ironman really is. It's one of the best little mini docs. It's about 20 minutes ever. But ABC was pissed. They're like, what? These guys are in our way all day long. So while Julie was crawling to the finish line, Valerie Silk was in the ABC trailer getting screamed at by the producer of the show, saying, Valerie, you have violated your contract. You allowed this other group to come here. We will never be back. The Ironman will never be on ABC Wide World of Sports again. And when she left meanwhile, his assistants, the producer's assistants, kept coming in, boss, you need to come see this. This is pretty amazing. And he didn't see it, and Valerie didn't see it. And when she left the trailer and heard that, Julie was in medical and would like to see her, and she walked over to see Julie, and Julie was like, Valerie, I'm so sorry. Can I come back next year? I'd like to do the race again, and hopefully I can win. And Valerie was like, sure, you can come back. But in her mind, it was, we're done. This event will never happen again. We'll never get ABC again. We've burnt that bridge by allowing this other group in. So then when ABC realized what the hell they had and how amazing that footage was, they moved the production up a month. And they, because this is on beta tape. They didn't edit that quickly. And then when it aired on Wide World of Sports, back then, ABC Wide World of Sports would do 3 vignettes. They would do roller derby, they do ice dancing, they do the Ironman triathlon. So as Julie is crawling to the finish line, and again, remember, 22-year-old co-ed with freckles, not 1980 Dave Scott needing to cool down after going 140.6 miles, not John Howard in 1981, the cyclist of the 70s and a 3-time Pan American Games gold medalist, a three-time Olympian and Pan American Games gold medalist. The viewers at home couldn't relate to these guys. Somebody in Pittsburgh seeing Dave Scott needing to cool down after a race is going, who are these people? They're watching because of the palm trees, and it's February, and you're in Pittsburgh or Cleveland. Well, now you got this 22-year-old co-ed and another 22-year-old co-ed named Kathleen, and Julie could be your daughter. She could be your girlfriend. She could be your sister. You can relate to her, and you're seeing her. I call it the original reality TV, raw and unfiltered. This woman who had crapped herself and is crawling on all fours with a smile on her face, collapsing on the finish line, being taken off on a stretcher, and people watching at home are like, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. This is ridiculous. This is stupid. What is it about that finish line that's so important that this woman will crawl to get there? And how do I get some of that in my life? That was our moment, right? And that's why that moment still lives on. And that led to the following weekend. Oh, so after this airs, and they go right from her on a stretcher with a smile on her face, they go to cliff diving or they go to roller derby. So people don't know if Julie Moss is dead or not. So people are calling Wide World of Sports, and the phone lines there, the switchboard, which people have no idea what that is, the switchboard's lighting up to the point where they flew Julie and Kathleen back to New York the following weekend after the show aired to assure and they were on with Jim McKay, the dean of Wide World of Sports, to assure the American public that this sport and this event do not kill people and that they are okay. And that led to Jim Curl and Carl Thomas getting together and going, we've got lightning in a bottle here. And they created the United States Triathlon Series for June of 82. Remember, that event was February of 82. It aired like in March. June of 82, creation of the United States Triathlon Series. And they did a second Ironman in October of 82 because of the popularity and those numbers went from a couple of hundred to 400, right? They basically doubled from the year before. Because now in October, people from other parts of the world besides Hawaii and California could actually train for this thing. You couldn't really train for it if in February, if you're living back, in Germany or anywhere else. So that moment led to everything else. That was the dominoes. And we all could feel it because all of a sudden, you're doing United States Triathlon Series wasn't on a remote island. It was San Diego. It was Chicago. It was San Francisco. It was New York. It was Boston. Big markets understanding this hot new sport. It was Budweiser. It was Coca-Cola red jersey. So the sport boomed. And all of it was because of Julie and Kathleen.
It's an incredible story. And I love hearing that you guys knew at the time, because that really is fascinating to me, because before I came to the sport, I knew about Julie. I had seen that. And when I first was introduced to the sport of triathlon, the first words out of my mouth was, I don't want to do that race in Hawaii, because I just had seen, that's all I knew.
Right.
But the second I got into triathlon, the first race I finished, all of a sudden the allure of that finish line in Hawaii just starts to call and beckon. And I am incredibly fortunate to have been able to do it once. I'm going back next year. So I'm very, very excited. And it's unlike anything that you can do anywhere or and I've done now 7 Ironmans, and they're all special. They're all fantastic. But that finish line in Hawaii really is really, really spectacular.
Well, you think about comparing it to another sport. If you're a tennis player, you can't go hang out with Roger Federer at Wimbledon, right? You can't compete with him. You can't go hang out with Tiger Woods at the Masters. But Jan Frodeno and you are doing the same course on the same day at the same time. He's going a little faster, but at the same time, if you run into him or Lionel Sanders, whoever, afterwards, you can compare notes. That's why I love this bond between our age groupers and our pros, because every pro was an age group and became a pro.
We're going to go a little out of order here, because I definitely wanted to get to that a little bit later on. But as I was telling you before we started recording, I had the great fortune of running into Lionel just after. So we're recording this in early December, and this probably won't air until the new year. But we're recording this in early December, just after I competed at the Indian Wells 70.3, where Lionel won the race. And I had the good fortune of being able to chat with him briefly after the awards, because Lionel, I have felt this way for a long time. He is so special as an individual, as a human being, because his story is so compelling. His story of coming from addiction to the sport and his redemption and really saving his life. But also because of who he is as an individual, he made himself available after the awards. He stood there for over an hour to speak to every single person who wanted to speak to him and have a selfie with him. And he greeted every single athlete exactly the same way. Every athlete would walk up to him, and he started with, "How was your day? How was your race out there?" Yep. And I overheard an athlete tell him that, I had a panic attack in the cold water. And immediately Lionel launched into a story about how he once had a panic attack in a race. And he just made this athlete feel so fantastic. And he is just such a remarkable person. And I was talking to his wife after, and I was just telling her how much I appreciate that Lionel is in our sport. He is emblematic of like you said, of how the pros are in our sport. They're very approachable. I had the good fortune of running into Lucy Charles Barkley at St. George, and I went all fanboy on her. I was like, I'm a 54-year-old man, and Lucy, I would love to have a picture with you. And she immediately was like, absolutely, and just was gracious. And they're just so approachable and so human and so wonderful in that way. And I agree with you. It's because we're all on the same course. They were all age groupers before, and it really is special.
Well, you think about both. You think about Lionel, and when I think about Lionel, I think about mom and dad, because this is a guy who did go down that slippery slope and snorted his collegiate money, money for college, and probably disappointed his parents so many different times. So imagine here's a kid who's used up a lot of your money over the years, and he goes, hey, I want to go to Louisville and do an Ironman, and I need to be able to get there. I need a kit. I need entry fee. I need, a lot of parents would have given up at that point, because it wasn't like he was 17, 18 years old, and they never did. They always believed in their son. And, to a certain, and Lionel knows that. Interviewing at Boston Marathon one year, Lionel was running and his mom was running. And Lionel, and we did an interview together with mom and with Lionel. And he was so caring for his mom. I don't know, there's just a very, very special bond there that all of us have with Lionel. All of us feel like we've been part of his journey.
Yeah. 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 Well, I'm a huge supporter of his, and I wish, and I mean, anyways, I could talk about him I'm not going to keep going. We'll talk about him another time, but I do want to ask you about something else that's very near and dear to your heart, and that's the Challenged Athlete Foundation. Sure. I have had the pleasure of speaking to athletes who on this podcast who race, who benefit from that foundation. And I'd love to hear what the genesis was for that, and how it has been such a huge passion, and such a great, your name was mentioned actually at Indian Wells when they gave the award to the challenged athlete who won. He made special mention of you and thanked you for your support. Yeah. Michael, so tell us about the Challenged Athlete Foundation.
Michael has dwarfism and is, I think, the second person with dwarfism to finish a 70.3. And he's just a very, very special young man who I see at the races every week. We take selfies every week at the races. He's like me. Any race that's out there he wants to do. And he told me his goal is to do an Ironman one day. And we got together just the day before he left to make sure we got new kits for him. And he's special. And all of our athletes are amazing. We're actually working on a film right now on a quadruple amputee baseball player from Indiana who's made his high school baseball team. He's missing both hands and both legs, one below the knee, one above the knee, and made his high school baseball team. And the film is called Just Watch Me. We're going to film festivals this winter, and it'll come out next spring. The producer, Eric Cochran, has been covering this kid for 7 years. But with Challenge Athletes Foundation, so going back to a guy named Jim McLaren, who was in 1985 was a 300-pound offensive lineman for Yale. And he was taking acting classes in New York City. And he was riding his motorcycle to class one day when he got hit by a bus, thrown 90 feet in the air, dead on arrival, lost his lower left leg. And back then, prosthetics were nothing like they are now. We're talking Captain Hook. And this guy ran a 3:16 marathon on that wooden, piece of crap. And then he went to Kona, where I met him, and he went 10:42 with a freaking, wooden prosthetic. So this guy is changing the world. Everybody knows who he is. He's the, amputee athlete who's changing the world. Then 8 years later, he's racing in Mission Viejo here in California. A van goes through a closed intersection, hits the back of his bike, propels him headfirst into a pole. A guy who's an amputee becomes a quadriplegic. And at that point, myself and two close friends, Jeffrey Esikow, who actually worked for a company called the Tinley Company, and Rick Kozlowski, who put on all the races in San Diego, got together, and we decided we wanted to put on a little triathlon as a fundraiser for Jimmy. I had covered a lot of wheelchair athletes through Competitor Magazine. And the one thing when I'd interview guys who were 30 years old, what's the worst part about being your new lot in life? You're paralyzed. How are you handling it? It says, well, the worst thing is that mom and dad are back in my life. I'm 30 years old. I'm not an independent adult anymore. And I was an independent adult. I need people to carry me around and be there for me. So the goal was to raise $25,000, buy Jimmy a van with hand controls so that he'd have independence. That was it. So we put on a little triathlon. We didn't raise 25, we raised 49,000. Thought our job is done, move on. Well, 3 amputee women who raced as a relay came to us and said, it's great what you did for Jimmy. Did you know that your health insurance, if you get injured, will cover a walking around leg or an everyday wheelchair? Nothing to do with sport is covered because they consider sport a luxury item. Sport's not a luxury item. It's a huge part of who we are and what we do. So that's when we got our 501(c) and decided if anybody needed a piece of equipment, training, or travel to stay in the game of life through sport, that CAF would be there. It's been 28 years. We've raised $134 million. We've sent out over 35,000 grants. During COVID, we sent out 3,038 grants totaling $5.1 million. And the cool part is we've sent out grants to athletes in 73 countries, all 50 states and Puerto Rico, and in 105 different sports, everything from paratriathlon to quad rugby, to beep baseball, which is baseball for the blind, to sled hockey. You name the sport. We had actually the latest in the Paralympics, we had 128 athletes representing CAF at the Paralympics in Tokyo. And in the medal count, we would have been 6th if we were a country. So that was very cool. Seeing our kids, some of these kids were 6, 7, 8 years old, and now they're 18 and went to their first Paralympics. And some of them, like Rudy Garcia Tolson, who's a double above knee amputee, we've been working with Rudy since he's 7, 8 years old, and he just went to his 5th Paralympics, and he's 30. I think he just turned 33. So just seeing our athletes become comfortable in their own skin, to feel powerful. That's when we first started CAF. I don't know if you remember this, but back in those days, charity was about violin music, commercials late at night with Sally Struthers, talking about how making your athletes look sympathetic and to me sort of pathetic, or you're the people who are needy. And in our situation, I wanted just the opposite of that. And so Tim Mantuani, this amazing photographer, we collaborated, and it was like, we want our athletes to look strong and powerful. So the first photos we took of Rudy, these are hero shots, shot from down low. You see the 2 prosthetic legs, his hands are on his hips, sort of looking right at you going, yeah, what are you looking at? You give me a piece of equipment, I'll kick your ass. And that was the attitude that I wanted. And that's the attitude that I think we've provided all these years.
Well, and that is something that comes up over and over when I've spoken with athletes who are facing some kind of physical challenge when they compete, is they do not want to be seen as overcoming something. They want to be seen as doing the same as everybody else with just, they need a piece of equipment, a little bit different.
Well, and that was really what happened with wheelchair athletes, because back even in 93, couldn't get wheelchair athletes into Ironman. Right. It was like the feeling was, if you let somebody, rather than swim, bike, run, if they swim, use a hand cycle, and then use a racing chair, the mentality was, well, if you do that, then someone's going to say, I don't swim and I want to use a windsurfer. I want to use a paddleboard. And I was like, well, no, you just write rules, hand cycle, wheelchair. You can't use a hand cycle and then run. You can't ride a regular bike. You can't ride a bike and then use a racing chair. You just have to come up with real rules and regulations. And then John Franks came and tried to make the cutoff times in 94. He missed the bike cutoff. And then in 95 and 96, a guy named John McLean from Australia missed the bike cutoff time both times. But in 97, he made all the cutoff times. And the cool part was, you know, the following year, after he made all the cutoff times, Carlos Moleda, Navy SEAL, who was shot in the back in Panama, Carlos went 10:55, which would have won the first 2 Ironmans overall, right? Sort of changed the game from, I don't think they can make the finish to how fast can they go? And can David Bailey beat Carlos Moleda? You know, the Navy SEAL against the motocross world champion, both of them paralyzed, both of them athletes, and the chair disappeared. It was 2 athletes who wanted to kick the other guy's ass, and the chair became invisible. And that's what I loved. It became athletes against other athletes, period.
Yeah, and that's really what it should be, and it's a remarkable thing that you and your partners have done, and I know that there are so many who are indebted to you. We could go on and on and on here. So I want to finish with a question here, and that is about Breakfast with Bob.
Yes.
How did that begin? And yeah, why don't we start there? How did it begin?
Well, you know, it goes back to in starting in 1990. Well, I started the competitor in 87, and we started competitor in 87. And then, you know, again, we weren't just growing our magazine, we were growing an industry. So when I went to a local sports radio station in 1990, the goal was, listen, on sports radio, you hear Magic Johnson, you hear Larry Bird, you hear Mike Trout, you hear all these guys. Well, Dave Scott, Mark Allen, Paul Newby Frazier, they are world-class athletes, and they should have a showcase on a sports radio station. So I did a time buy for competitor radio that started in 1990. And basically until a year ago, we every Sunday night from 1990 to 2020, we had a 2-hour time slot where we showcased the greatest endurance athletes on the planet. And it was a great way. So people who would be listening to mainstream sports stuff, then all of a sudden were exposed to the sport of triathlon. And I just loved the interviewing. I loved the long form interviews and being able to showcase Lance, you know, in his early days when he was, you know, we started covering him when he was 15 years old, and we're there when, you know, we were very tight when he was diagnosed with cancer, and we talked about he didn't think he'd ever be able to ride again, but he was just going to enjoy every day that he had left, because we didn't know if he was going to live or not. So that led to, you know, doing long form interviews. I would do those in Kona on the radio, and I would tape them and then play them from Kona on the Sunday night radio show. And then we started when we became competitor group, and we owned Triathlete Magazine and all the rock and roll marathons. With that, we launched in, I think, like 2011, 2012, we launched Breakfast with Bob from Huggos and eventually Huggos on the Rocks. And what I love about it is, you know, we interviewed Daniela Reef when she first came to the island, and while we're interviewing her, she's like, "So is this street here? Is this where we run?" Right? We drive, right? She's like, "Yeah, Danielle, you'll be running along there." You know, and Sebastian Kienle before he won his first title, and Jan Frodeno and Patrick Lange and Lucy Charles. When Lucy Charles came on the show, and I was like, "So give me an idea what you swim in a typical week." And she said, 100,000 yards. And I was just like, "Wait, what?" The learning, meeting these athletes and learning about them, and having Chrissy Wellington in 2011, when she just had the race of her life, knowing her body was compromised and beating Marinda Carfrae by 2 minutes, just all those amazing moments. And I've always felt our athletes don't get the recognition they deserve. So one of the things we started back in 2016 or so is we did a deal with Four Seasons Resort, Four Seasons Hualalai. And what Four Seasons does is the top 3 men and women are picked up in limos and brought out to Four Seasons. We shoot in a $17,000 a night villa. We shoot the interviews there on Sunday morning. They bring their families out for a full-on catered breakfast for them and their families. which is what they deserve. And then when the first place person comes on, your overall champion, their bakers over there at Four Seasons do a unbelievable cake presentation for the overall champion. So the year that Daniela was stung by a jellyfish, this presentation that she got from their bakers had a jellyfish incorporated into it. Everything on it was edible. It was so cool. It was one of those things that I just love, the fact that the athletes are treated as celebrities, because that's what they deserve and that's what they've earned. And, the TO a couple of years ago was like, hey, I don't want to fall out of the top 3. I want to go to Four Seasons.
Well, they deserve it. And you're so right. Hawaii is the big show for them. And so if they're going to get it, they might as well get it there. And they definitely deserve it.
Absolutely.
Bob Babbitt, I feel like a celebrity having had the chance to talk with you today. And I'm so grateful for you taking this much time to share all of these fantastic memories and insights about our sport. I definitely hope to be able to chat with you again, because there are many questions I didn't even get to, and I have some ideas about how we might be able to do that. So thank you again for taking so much time and being so gracious, and for joining me today on the TriDoc Podcast.
Jeff, thank you very much. And it's always good to chat about the old stuff, because you know what, our history is very rich. And I look around this room here, and I'm looking at a portrait of Dave Scott that sort of combines both worlds. One of our athletes who's a quadriplegic painted this amazing portrait of Dave Scott that I'm staring at right now. And it's sort of the challenged athlete and one of our legends of our sport. So I love our sport. I love our athletes, and anything we can do to help grow our sport and keep getting new people in, because once they're there, once you put that number on, we got you. You're there for life. You will be with us forever.
Yep. No truer words were said.
Thank you, brother.